Welcome and thank you for joining us for this episode of GodCast, recorded at Meadowbridge, Seventh-day Adventist Church, 7400 Antique Lane, Mechanicsville, Virginia, 23116. Join us any Saturday for service. Sabbath school begins at 11 a.m. and our worship service begins at noon. We do hope to see you there. But until then, please sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of GodCast. There's a seat waiting for you.
I'm Lorraine, your host. On behalf of the GodCast ministry team and the Meadowbridge Seventh-day Adventist Church, welcome and thank you for joining us for this episode of GodCast, How to Life with God. Last month we started a series on forgiveness, and today we will continue that series talking about forgiveness in families as well as forgiving yourself. Is that even really a thing? Joining me today to discuss that are Carla, Amaris, Sierra, Mark, and Lee. So let's get into it. Well, thank you all for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Every time someone sacrifices their time to spend with us and to share with our audience, we're very grateful. Today we're continuing our series on forgiveness, and we're going to focus on forgiveness in families and forgiveness of yourself. So the first question is one that I always ask, and everyone gets a chance to answer that. And that question is, what is forgiveness?
Well, that's something I've always had a problem with, is forgiveness, because it's usually brought up in the context of some huge wrong that's been done to you and then how you respond to it. And it's funny because just yesterday I was in a situation with a family member, and I thought the person was quite rude, and I was feeling bad about it, and then seems like the Lord spoke to me and said, well, it's not that important, just let it go. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to break it down for me into this kind of smaller bites. That's more what I would call forbearance.
Okay.
Just dealing with somebody's, what you regard as somebody's faults, mm-hmm. and the attitude you take to it. So because I didn't make a big deal about that, it was, the relationship went better.
Okay, I like that.
Well, I like to say, forgiveness to me is that family members, sometimes we have disagreements, and sometimes you think it's the other person's fault. And when you examine yourself, you find out it was your fault. Mm-hmm. And then you go back and ask for forgiveness, and sometimes they don't want to forgive you. But once you ask them to forgive you, if they say yes or no, you have to ask God to forgive you, and then you forgive yourself. Because if you don't forgive yourself, you can't move on.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think that forgiveness is a mutual thing, whereas you have to humble yourself in order for somebody else to be humble towards you. And when you are asking for forgiveness or when you're receiving forgiveness, I think it's really personal, and you have to understand where that forgiveness came from. And I think you always have to reevaluate what you did and make sure you don't do it again, or what somebody else did, and make sure you communicate that that was hurtful. And I think that's how the process of forgiveness comes out.
You said something that in these kind of conversations, we hear a lot of talk about wrongs that were done to you, but then, so who's doing these wrongs? Because every time we talk about it, it's like they did wrong to me, but so none of us did wrong to anyone else, I guess.
Mm-hmm. But I don't
think so.
I don't think that's true, because
no, I don't either.
I've done wrong to other people, and I've asked them to forgive me, but like I say, until you forgive yourself, you have to ask God to forgive you, and you really have to decide, Lord, remind me not to say this or do this again. and be sincere about it. And then once God forgives you, then you forgive yourself. That's the most important thing. Most people will forgive everybody else, but never forgive themselves.
To me, that is the hardest part, forgiving yourself,
Yeah.
because I can go through forgiving somebody else because they did something wrong. I can go through forgiving somebody else because I think they did something wrong and that person doesn't even know. So I need to accept, well, that person is that way. But after all is said and done, if I did something wrong, I think that's the hardest part. And I feel it's because God knows us. So I forgive you for doing something to me because this is all I see. And I want to take your word for it. Well, you say you forgive me, we're good. But then God knows me and everything else that's inside. So to me, it's harder, and it comes with a lot of peace once you get to the point. But to get to that point, it's quite a process.
Right.
I think that forgiveness is a choice to give of yourself before you know if someone is trustworthy, before you know if someone is going to hurt you again, in spite of if they actually do hurt you or break your trust. I just kind of think about God's forgiveness and literally that He chose to give His Son to us before He knew that we would ever decide to receive His salvation. So I think about forgiveness as willing to let go and also sacrifice your own selfish desires before you know what the outcome is going to be.
I think that's very important because I think the reason forgiveness is difficult is because of the desire to defend ourselves, which is, and as I was thinking about this before the program, I was thinking, should we defend ourselves? That's not an easy question. And sometimes we need to defend ourselves, but when you bring it right down to it, Jesus didn't defend himself.
Right. Right.
But I think too, in order, before you can even start forgiving, like she said, you have to humble yourself.
Right.
That's the first process. You got to humble yourself and admit that what you said or did was wrong. But you don't get any peace until you actually forgive yourself.
Right.
So you still walk around thinking, well, I haven't forgiven, even though Christ says that He will forgive us when you ask. But I found it very hard. If you don't forgive yourself, you're still walking around with the guilt.
Right.
And the guilt is what causes you to doubt God.
Right. Or even be triggered if someone else does something close to what hurt you before and you have not let it go completely. It could be a whole different person in just a similar situation, but you respond to that person as if it was the previous situation, and it's just bad.
It's not healthy.
I think as in reference to guilt and just other things that people have mentioned, there's a verse in Psalms, I don't know the scripture and I can give it to you later, where David talks about how his bones were aching and it's like his body was really, the guilt was weighing so heavy on him that his descriptiveness of how that impacted him, I read that in 2005 and I was going through a similar situation where I had done wrong and I had not confessed that yet. And it weighs you down because the Holy Spirit is saying, hey, you need to do this. So, you asked, have we ever been the one doing wrong? I think we all will admit that we have. But we do often think about forgiveness from the other perspective of us having to forgive someone else because we've been hurt. And certainly there's been those situations as well, but being able to forgive yourself, even after you have confessed, can sometimes be difficult because of what you said, Carla, because you see the other ugly stuff inside of you that isn't gone yet. start to kind of make that, not bigger in the sense that it is big that we have sin in us, but we make it so huge, like this one thing happened, and now we're just kind of like the worst person in the world, and we don't see God being able to forgive.
You have to have a very, I don't want to say close relationship with God, because that could be different definition for everybody, but you really have to rely on God, because I have gotten to the point of, okay, well, I forgive myself, I know, God and I, okay, we're good, but then I feel like I'm brushing it off. You know what I'm saying? So I don't want to get to the point that, well, I know God is gonna forgive me. I'm good, and then move on, and then something else. Well, it happened. I know He's gonna forgive me.
Right.
I don't want to go into that cycle. You really have to have that relationship with God. That when you feel forgiven, honestly, and in your heart, then that needs to be fixed. Move on, and at least not do it on purpose again.
Right.
But,
Exactly.
just know exactly where you are.
Right.
But the hardest, I'm sorry. The hardest thing about, like, even though God forgives you, you forgive yourself, a lot of times that, like when you're with people that know about the situation, you wonder, well, I know they're thinking this and they're saying that.
That's true.
But because you know that you have been forgiven, I mean, you still have to walk and deal with those people and treat them the same way you did before that happened. And that can be a growing process.
Yes.
When you do that. Because some people, they would hide. They don't want to be seen because of this thing that was done. But you can't do that, because if you're in Christ and Christ forgave you and you forgave yourself, it doesn't matter if anybody else forgives you or not, because then that becomes their problem.
Yes,
Yes.
that's true.
Going
That's
along with what sorry.
No, you're I understand.
Going along with what you said, I think that forgiveness, along with humbling yourself, you need to not be arrogant, because forgiveness is not when you're telling somebody you were wrong, period, and you need to make sure that you apologize to me. It's not always about me, like, you need to apologize to me, you did wrong to me. Forgiveness is also the other person realizing that they are wrong, so not only do they not hurt you again, but they don't hurt somebody else. And I think when it's forgiveness between you and God, there's also a sense of arrogance when you say, well, I forgive myself, so God should too. But you should address that with God, no matter what, regardless of how you feel.
Well, I think we've been flirting around the idea of reconciliation, which to me, forgiveness doesn't mean much without the possibility, at least, of reconciliation.
Right.
But the goal is in the area of relationships.
Right.
But it may not be possible. But as I think you said, at least you can have an attitude where you're willing to see if it's possible, test the waters.
Right. I think that in our last discussion, we talked about forgiveness as it relates to church, but then some other family stuff came up too, because I think those are the people that we spend the most time with. So that's often the people that we have to be forgiven by, and we have to forgive the most. But the point that forgiveness is really only real in the context of relationships. It's not just an isolated theoretical term that you can just throw around. It's about relationships. So absolutely, reconciliation needs to be the goal. It needs to be a part of that. And we know that there are things that people do that are so detrimental, there may not be an opportunity for reconciliation. But how do you forgive a family member who may have done something egregious? While is it necessary that if you forgive that person that you have to be in relationship with them still? Do you feel like that's a requirement of forgiveness?
I don't necessarily know if the relationship, depending on how the hurt transpired and what the responses were after that, I'm not sure if the relationship can be the same, but I think you can have that that family love. You may not be able to be as close with that person anymore. I can think about a situation where someone in my family hurt me a lot of times really bad, and to this day we're not as close because they are unwilling to converse about what has happened between us. They have even chosen to say, well, God told me that we don't need to talk about it, we just need to move forward. But I always think to myself, how can we really move forward and make sure things like that don't happen again,
Right.
if we don't come to a clear understanding? And they also went further on to say that I just don't know what it may or may not escalate to. And you're right, you don't know what it may or may not escalate to. And so now, honestly, I feel awkward around the individual. I will respect them, but I am unwilling to be as close as we used to be because there's so much left unsaid, and they are unwilling to meet me halfway. I have decided to forgive that person and accept an apology that I will never receive. And I also made the choice to actually apologize to that person and let them know that I do forgive them. And that's just sometimes where you have to leave it. You can continue to build on those relationships that you are able to continue to build on, but sometimes reconciliation has to go as far as we agree to get along, but it doesn't mean that we have to actually be best friends that speak every day and are always at each other's events. We just might have to, whenever we do happen to be at the same family functions, just, hey, how you doing, give you a hug and keep moving.
But I had an incident with a family member like that, and we were even speaking, right? And that person would not speak to me, wouldn't answer my phone calls, wouldn't talk to me. So I prayed about it, and so God said, write them a letter. So I wrote them a letter and put everything in that letter that had been going on between us. And so after the person read the letter, and I guess they thought about it for a few weeks, something happened in the family, and we had to have a get-together. And then that family member said, well, I really appreciate the letter because I wasn't aware that all that had transpired. And because we couldn't talk, because I would start talking and she started yelling and start cursing. And then I started crying. And so we just couldn't talk. We couldn't get together at all. But that letter, when I wrote the letter, I was thinking maybe she could just tear it up. So I didn't put my name on the back of the letter. I just wrote her the letter. And she opened it. And so when we got together at a family gathering, I still talked to her. And we just went on. And then when she came up and said that she appreciated the letter, but she wasn't aware that all that had transpired, and she asked me if I would forgive her. So we hugged and made up, but we still, like you said, we are not the best of friends, but we tolerate each other. We are family, and we try to work things out when we all together. But like I said, if she would invite me to come visit her, I will, and I'll invite her, she'll come to me. But we know that, we family, and we have to forgive, and we have to forget, because if you don't forget, you're still stuck in the middle.
I think that a lot of people fail to forget that even if you apologize and you forgive somebody, that doesn't mean that you're not going to hurt anymore. And a lot of times, people get angry that you're still hurting. And I don't think that's fair, because people are like, you said that you forgive me, or you forgave me for what I did, but that doesn't mean that I'm not hurt by it. If I wasn't hurt, I wouldn't ask for the apology in the first place. But I think with families, the pain can be more significant because that's the person you love. That's the person that has seen you since you were young. and that cares about you. It's easier to forgive a friend from school than it is to forgive your mother or your father for something that they've done. But I think that forgiveness is a really powerful and significant emotion and feeling towards someone, because even when you forgive someone, forgiving doesn't mean that you aren't allowed to have any emotions towards that person anymore. Forgiving just means that you've humbled yourself and that you've accepted what happened. But forgiving doesn't mean that you have to disregard all of your emotions that come towards you when you're thinking about the situation.
And the other thing too, forgiveness frees you.
Right.
It doesn't free the other person, it frees you.
Yes.
You mentioned your parents and so on. It's struck me recently that there's something about the parental relationship that's so important to our lives. But maybe I'm just because I'm American or something, but for me it's my mother, my father, my brother. Those are the ones that are most important to me. And the fifth commandment is really powerful, that regardless of what has been done, I think I've tried to find a way, and I've had wonderful parents, so it hasn't been so hard. I've tried to find a way to understand them. And I never, you know how people go in and especially in counseling situations, they just run on and on about their mother or their father. I don't think that's a good idea. Now that, I don't know if you want to talk about that, but I don't do that because that's just me.
Well, you mentioned that you like to keep the fifth commandment, which happens to be honor your father and mother. And you had parents that were easy to honor, it sounds like. Everyone hasn't had that privilege. And parents can be the most empowering influence in your life, or they could be the most destructive influence in your life because they're the first influence in your life. And for some people, their personality, their character, their baggage, if you will, was created by their parents. And so you may not want to publicize your situation, but to go to someone to say, hey, this is my history. How do I get past my history? Can be productive. It can be destructive if you do it the wrong way, but it also can be productive.
But you know, I thought about this while she was talking, that with family member that there was a problem between us. So another family member was having Thanksgiving dinner. So she called me and invited me to Thanksgiving dinner. So I said, well, if such a person gonna be there, I said, because if that person gonna be there, I'm not coming. I said, because that's supposed to be a time of peace and happiness and joy. And I don't feel like, going through all that commotion this time. And she said, yeah, she gonna be here. I said, well, I'm not coming. So she talked to the person and she called me back and she said, well, I told her that you was coming and that you won't come because of what's going on. And she said to tell you to come on and she would behave.
I think that sometimes with thinking about that fifth commandment, it can be, as you said, difficult if you don't have the experience where your parents did the best they could carefully. Because I know that in speaking to someone in my family, they were saying that their own parents kind of took advantage of that scripture. And I personally feel like in the African American community especially, that parents feel like you are supposed to take anything they do to you because they are your parents. And then when you have problems down the line as an adult, they don't want to deal with it because they'll say, well, you're disrespecting me by bringing up what I've done to you in the past. And you're often told to just be quiet and take it. And I explained to this person that it's time for you to no longer accept the abuse, because you are an adult now, and just because you make a choice to no longer accept your parents' abuse does not mean you are dishonoring them. You are now protecting yourself, and you should get the help that you need, because this parent to that individual was not easy to honor at all. And they did kind of, in my opinion, manipulate that commandment to validate the not so good things that they were doing. So I think we just have to be careful sometimes when we are in a position of parenting, that we still do not damage or break our kids in a way that we now say, well, you have to honor me regardless, you know, regardless of if I tear down your character, regardless if I lash out at you because I'm really mad at your dad or your mom. You have to take it, because that's kind of teaching our children something later on down the line that we probably don't want to see.
Right. It's funny that you mentioned that, because in our first episode of GodCast, we talked about just generally how to life with God. And one of our participants brought up, how do you honor a parent that was abusive? And so how do you forgive a parent, or I will say a parent, because to me, parents are just, they're critical in our life. They're the first people from the beginning. How do you honor? Because we're coming from a spiritual Christian perspective that says, God says honor. And he doesn't qualify if they're a good parent or a bad parent or whatever. How do you honor by your parent, or forgive a parent that's done wrong, while still honoring yourself in the sense of protecting yourself from further harm? Carla?
I think there's kind of a mystery there. I mean, whether the commandment has been abused by others is no doubt.
Right.
But the commandment still stands. So your questions are very, I mean, now let's say it was, you know, the worst case scenario, serious abuse or something like that. Even in, I'm not sure what it is, but even in that situation, there's a way to honor your parent. Maybe it's by you going a different way, by you taking that example and helping others who might be experiencing that. That's, in a way, that's honoring them.
It's really hard when you have not been in a situation like that, because I feel we all can say what we think, and then that one person that have been through that extreme abuse is not going to take any of these options or suggestions. My mom was a single mom since I was 11. My dad wasn't. He was there, but my dad and my mom, when they got divorced, we moved to a different city, and that helped. And I mean, I can say a lot of things about my dad, but he's still my dad. I love him. I miss him. I haven't seen him in 20 years because he's still in Venezuela. I wish I could see him. I wish him the best. I pray that God takes care of him because I'm not there. But I have to leave it at that. Like, I cannot do anything else. Forgive him for something. Maybe the one time that he said that, or he said something, or he did something, he doesn't even remember. So am I gonna carry that grudge when he doesn't even know?
Right.
So I have to accept that person for who he is. And ever since we started the conversation, the word that keeps coming to my mind is, you said right away, humble. And that is so powerful. You have to do everything with a humble heart. You forgive them Sometimes we forget, sometimes we don't forget, but don't use that.
Right.
Just let it go. It happened, you cannot change it, like you said. It happened. And you have to pray for them. It's so much, I know it's hard, but once you get to the point, it's just so much easier to forgive and move on than carrying all that weight. Because you may know what you did to me. You may not even know. So am I going to be sad and have that miserable life when you don't even know what you did? Honestly, you didn't even know. Or you did, you just don't care. You
Right.
know, so you have to get to a point where you have to be selfish in a good way. And you talk to God, and that's where it needs to end, you and God, and just move on and keep being really close to God.
Forgiveness is such a personal thing because it really addresses the hurts that have entered your life. And when we talk about forgiveness in families, that can become really hard to deal with. But our guests were very open, and they shared, and they've had experiences where maybe they haven't forgiven, and then experiences where, as hard as it was, they were able to forgive. And so we want to encourage you, as our viewers, to really think about the fact that when you don't forgive, it really causes irreparable separation, especially in families. We know that it's hard. If you want somebody to walk with you through that process, please reach out to us at mbsda.godcast@gmail.com, and one of the ministry team will reach out to you. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel at Meadowbridge SDA Church. Hit the notification bell, like, share, and comment so others can be inspired as well. And join us next time when we will ask more questions and seek more answers as we continue moving Godward.